Many thanks, Paul, for those very gracious and eloquent remarks. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to have Paul Churchland commenting on me today. You know, I feel like I grew up at the knee of Paul Churchland, as well as Pat Churchland and Dennet. And so when I was a graduate student coming into philosophy, these were the titans of the field. So it's still a little bit you know, intimidating and awe-inspiring to have someone like this serve as a commentator. You know, I grew up reading Paul's work on eliminative materialism and the propositional attitudes, of course, but also his work on consciousness. There's really some wonderful work from the 1980s that Paul did. His paper on reductionism, qualia, and the direct introspection of brain states, I think, is really a classic of the field. It's maybe a little bit underappreciated these days, but really some glorious ideas about how neuroscience might transfigure our understanding of consciousness. And much of the work put together in his later book on a neurocomputational perspective, and then the later books on consciousness have all had a big impact on me. And one of those impacts is, you know, that one should very much be open to revisionary ideas about consciousness. And that's, I think, a very central theme in the work of Paul and of Pat. One shouldn't just stick rigidly to our initial naive folk conception of phenomena such as consciousness. It could turn out to be quite radically unlike what one might have expected pre-theoretically. And I think that's a lesson that you know, we should all learn from the likes of Paul and Pat and Dan. That said, I probably haven't learned all the lessons that Paul would have liked me to have learned from his work. So maybe I can go into some of the relevant respects of disagreement here. So Paul is focused on, you know, a number of arguments that I give in this paper on consciousness and its place in nature. The explanatory argument, the conceivability argument, and the knowledge argument. Actually dismiss the explanatory argument fairly quickly. Although a lot of attention in the literature is focused on, you know, the conceivability argument and zombies and the technicalities of the knowledge argument, and there's a lot to say about those things. My own view is that actually the explanatory argument is the fundamental one here. And it basically has a couple of premises. It comes from the thought that, well, what do you get from physical explanation? You get a certain kind of physical explanation, has a certain character, certain basic structures and dynamics over those structures, ultimately explaining certain functional roles, causal roles, which is wonderful, which provides you a wonderful kind of explanation which has been incredibly successful throughout the sciences, in particular in those cases where functions and functional roles are what we need to be explained, where they're the primary explanander. So for something like the explanation of life, where the primary explanander are things like, you know, adaptation and reproduction and growth and control and so on, all functional roles, you get a very natural kind of explanation out of this from physical methods. Certain basic structures, dynamics over those structures, performs the functions, explains the functions. But there's also a limitative claim here, and the thought is that the kind of structure and function you get from physical explanation only ultimately explains complex structures and functions, and that claim can be made precise in various more complex ways. The second premise is the claim that when it comes to explaining consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, one needs to explain more than the functions. When it comes to the data, you know, I really start this, again, this can get technical with zombies, conceivability, and the knowledge arguments, but I really start this like a botanist. What are the phenomena of consciousness that we need to explain? What are the data? And you know, the basic data, well, there are data of behavior, the things people do. There are data you'll get from measuring their brains and so on. But there are also introspective data on the face of it. There are data about what it's like to be a conscious subject, what it's like to be me experiencing now and hearing now what it's like to feel emotion or to hear music. And prima facie, I take these things as data and as providing phenomena that need to be explained. And if you're cataloging the data of consciousness that need to be explained, well, first of all, you can give a list of the various functions in, fairly standard cognitive scientific framework. Things like perceptual discrimination and integration and control of behavior and verbal report and so on. And these are all things that clearly need explaining. But that list is an incomplete catalog of the data. There's also further data that need explaining, the data of consciousness. And my claim is that explaining consciousness is not, as an explanatory problem, the problem about explaining various functional roles. And this is where this distinction between the easy problems and the hard problem that's received a lot of attention is basically just a way of encapsulating that basic distinction, the problems of explaining these various functional roles and the problem of explaining consciousness. Now, there are some people, like Dan Dennet, who think that no, in fact, all we need to explain is explain the functions, the responses, the reports especially. And in doing that, we'll have explained consciousness. That's a line which Keith and Andy and others and Nick have been embracing eloquently here as well. And I respect that line. I find it extremely implausible, and so do many people. Many people find that this is not, this is just not taking consciousness seriously. But I respect that, But I respect the view. And indeed, way back in my book, The Conscious Mind, 20 years ago, I said, a lot depends on your starting point here. Dan has a starting point which he calls, I think he's embraced the name third-person absolutism at some point, where what are the data that would need to be explained is all the stuff that you measure from the third-person point of view. And that's going to naturally lead to a view where it's things like, the ultimate exponanda are the behaviors and the brain measurements and so on. Explain that, we can explain everything. If you don't embrace that third-person absolutism, though, to many people it seems that there are data of the first-person perspective which go beyond that list, then you're going to very naturally be led to the view that the standard functional explanation of cognitive science doesn't. Although it does a wonderful job at explaining those third-person data, which are all the things on Dan's list, it doesn't yet explain why all that is accompanied by conscious experience, the thing revealed in the first-person data, and therefore it gives an incomplete explanation of the relevant phenomena. So it's really fairly straightforward, and it's not technical at this point. Now, Paul's response is the issue between someone like Dan and me is there actually something to be explained beyond explaining the functions, and to be explained beyond explaining the reports, and so on. And that's an issue we've been talking about at the consciousness, and that's a big one to get into. But interestingly, Paul's line is nothing like that. So Dan's line is roughly the line I call type A materialism, which says that, all you've got to explain is explain these various functions. There's no further thing to be explained, and we can give a physical explanation of those things, thereby closing the relevant epistemic gaps. Paul's line is very different, and as I've heard him talk at this conference, it's become more and more clear to me that Paul seems to be actually paradigmatic of what I call the type B materialist, which is, well, we find these very nice correlations and connections between consciousness, the first-person data, and underlying brain processes. And these correlations should lead us abductively to postulate an identity between them. That's what these conscious states are. After all, we find these nice little structural matches between consciousness and certain informational structures or in brain states. Those that's the kind of thing that ought to lead us to postulate, here's a bold hypothesis. Consciousness is identical to those brain processes. With those identities, one can then read off and explain the facts about consciousness. So only with those identities in hand. This is a very, very, I can't stress enough how different I think this is from the model of the type A materialist that somebody like Dan is approaching, is endorsing, at least from my perspective. I mean, Paul puts the issue in terms of getting back to the explanatory argument. He made it all turn on entailment, deductive entailment. I think deductive entailment is a bit of a red herring. Nothing in the arguments I give turns on deductive entailment. But I gave that little argument I gave a second ago about explanation, didn't really mention entailment, and I think one can raise the issues within, say, a scientific context without getting into entailment at all, and that's what goes on in many of the debates over the hard problem. That said, I do think, and I think this is probably maybe the deepest difference between us here, is a debate about the structure of explanation in science. That reductive explanation in science, the kind of reduction that the kind of explanation that supports a physicalist reduction of various phenomena, like, say, life and the gene and certain processes like learning and so on, ultimately does turn on there being a certain kind of entailment from the low-level phenomena to the high-level phenomena, or at least it being available in principle. This is what, people talk about transparent explanation of the phenomena of, say, genetic phenomena in terms of DNA. Now, of course, it's not. Of course, Watson and Crick, in putting forward the hypothesis that DNA was the basis of the gene, did not actually give us a transparent explanation of genetic phenomena. But I think they at least made it possible to see how a transparent explanation could ultimately, in the fullness of time, be present. DNA plays these functional roles in encoding hereditary characteristics and gets processed developmentally and so on, and the reproductive mechanisms and developmental mechanisms. You could at least, by that point, imagine the story being fleshed out in a way in which in subsequent decades it's begun to be fleshed out, so you get a transparent explanation from the bottom level to the top level. And it's not, I think, in this case that, and I think really, so I guess my view is that this kind of reduction is actually identities between, the identity, say, between the reduction of genes to DNA is somehow hostage to and dependent on the possibility of a transparent explanation. Your view, I think, is, you only get the transparent explanation once you've got the identity. So I read all the, I give you all the DNA stuff and the bottom level about DNA processing and mechanisms, and then we add in the identity claim that the DNA is such and such a genetic mechanism. Then one can read off all the genetic phenomena. My view is even without the identity in principle, like the Laplacian super scientist who eventually comes along, didn't even have the concept of a gene, from eventually looking at DNA as implemented in real organisms and seeing the processes it undergoes, is going to be able to figure out that in fact is the basis of all the of the genetic phenomena, and that such and such genetic laws are obeyed or disobeyed or whatever. And that will basically be a kind of, it's not a deductive entailment, as you say, it won't go through in logic, but through knowing the stuff and the base, they're going to be able to figure out that the stuff at the higher level obtains without first going through an identity. And actually, this whole subject is the theme of my recent book, Constructing the World, where I call the relevant notion scrutability. The question, given the low-level facts, you can read off the high-level facts without needing further empirical information. It's not a matter of logical deduction, but it's a matter of a certain connection in the realm of knowledge. And I think that's very much, by the way, so when I look at Dan's work, say, for example, the kind of thing that Keith is saying, or even that Andy is saying, I see very much the sense that to explain a phenomenon like consciousness, we want that kind of transparent explanation. Given the low-level stuff, you can see why the high-level stuff had to be that way. And although it's not a matter of deductive entailment, it is ultimately the kind of thing that the Laplacian super scientists who came along and saw the low-level stuff could see that the high-level stuff just had to be there. In a certain sense, they could read it off. The picture I get from you is something very different. It's this picture where we adduce certain identities. So this is to say there's a constraint on something in the vicinity of entailment on reductive explanation in the sciences. Without that constraint, then you've got something like what I call in this paper a brute identity. Now, to be sure, you can postulate there's a connection between say, DNA and the gene. I think in that case you don't need to, but in the case of consciousness, what we're left with is the bold postulate that where there's this neural state, then there's consciousness. But it's basically brute. I mean, in a way, the alternative view is the identity has to be earned. The DNA gets to count as the gene in virtue of these various properties that you can figure out that it has based on the lower level story that kind of suffice, that more or less entail that it has to be a gene. In virtue of playing all those functional roles, the low level story forces the conclusion that DNA plays these various functional roles in reproduction and so on. That's all it is to be. That's all it means to be a gene. So you get a kind of entailment out of that. The alternative story, the type B story, I think, is to say, oh no, the identity comes first. And that's, I mean, my reasons for rejecting this picture would be long and complicated. But basically, I think when you actually, you know the philosophy of science far, far better than I do. So I'm not going to say, when you actually go through the science and all the great detail with which I have done, because of course I've done no such thing. But you know, nonetheless, I think you know what you find when you look at a lot of important episodes in the history of science is that something like transparent explanation is used as a constraint. And on the kind of picture you're telling of consciousness, I just don't think you get the one where you postulate the identity, and only with the identity do you get to read off the high level phenomenon. I don't think it meets the constraint of transparent explanation. It's like, yeah, we find a certain kind of structural correlation between the states. I mean, this is it's interesting. You and Ned Block are very much of a piece here. It's like, oh, we find this interesting correlation between a brain state and consciousness. Let's postulate that there these structural connections. Let's postulate that their identity. Then, given the identity, we can read off the higher level phenomenon. To me, that's a brute interlevel connection of a kind that's very unlike what one finds elsewhere in the sciences. And at this point, I think we'd have to go through some of the key cases from the history of biology and chemistry and so on. Obviously, that's going to be too much to do here. But I just want to point out that quite serious difference in perspective. I mean, I never see anywhere in the work of Paul or of Pat and so on the very strong deflationary line that someone like Dan wants to take, which is when it comes to explaining consciousness, all we got to do is explain this stuff like the reports and the reactions and so on. Those are all the phenomena there are. Rather, I see a view which takes the phenomenology in certain respects more seriously, and then the likes of Dan finds structural connections, postulates the correlation. So that's, I think, that's probably going to end up being the key difference between you and me, and also between me and other type B materialists like Ned Block and so on. Basically, it's to say that you reject what I would call the requirement of a transparent explanation, whereas someone like me and like Dan is going to endorse it. Anyway, that's on the explanatory argument. On the conceivability argument, actually, I'm not sure why you said that I require that identities have to be necessary. I mean, I'm inclined to go along with that Kripkean view, but I think it plays no central role in the conceivability argument. It's just to say that if consciousness doesn't necessitate, if physical processes don't necessitate consciousness, then the connection between them is contingent. And now we can bring in the Kripkean metaphor of, therefore, you know, God had to do more work in making the world that it is. If it turns out there's even a possible world where stuff is physically like so without consciousness, then to ensure the world has the particular phenomenal character that it does, first of all, you've got to make sure the physical structure of the world is like so. Then, we haven't yet fully determined the state of the world. If this other world of, for example, zombies is consistent with that, so you've got to do more work. So you've got to at least to add some further properties to this world. Now at this point, if you think maybe these are, I mean, I think with this brute, I think these ultimately, this is going to be part of the brutally contingent elements of our world. I mean, I think of science in a way as a practice of trying to reduce all the contingency there is in the world to certain fairly limited kinds of contingency. And I would say that limited kind of contingency is the kind you find in fundamental laws and initial conditions. You're going to say, no, well, there's a bit more extra contingency here. The contingency we find in identities. Laws, making the connection, say, from physical processes to consciousness. You end up saying it's an identity, I end up saying it's a law. But the explanatory structure, I think, of these brute contingent connections crossing the gap, it's got an oddly sort of dualist flavor in its explanatory structure. And again, I think this is going to turn on contrasting the consciousness case to all these other domains where I think one finds a tighter connection. But that's my, my take on it. Or the knowledge argument. There's any number of different kinds of knowledge. There's any number of different things you might mean by know. The mere fact that there's different kinds of knowledge doesn't mean that when we say no, we're equivocating. I'd be inclined to run the knowledge argument, fixing on a certain kind of knowledge, propositional knowledge, knowledge of facts, knowledge of the ways the world is. And it's true that we can know things in many, many different ways, by reasoning, by introspection, by acquaintance, and so on. Nonetheless, I'm inclined to think that fixing on one of these kinds of knowledge, like fixing on a certain notion of propositional knowledge, that even if it turns out there's different kinds of propositional knowledge, as you eloquently point out, this observation doesn't block the argument from going through when you use the, let's say, the determinable kind rather than the determinate propositional knowledge. So I'd be inclined to run it through that way. As for the positive program of panpsychism and so on, oh boy, there's so much to say about these things. I should say that, so I won't say most of them. I should say that I don't take myself to be committed to panpsychism or pan-proto-psychism. I take it as one of the options, certainly one of the more radical and revisionary options. So I take my inspiration from you in this respect, but certainly not the only option. And there are many. There are other sort of more conservative forms of dualism, for example, where we just say we've got physical processes and psychophysical laws and consciousness connected to that, and that needn't be panpsychist, panpsychist at all. In fact, I could probably take what you believe with involving identities and turn it into a dualist proposal involving laws, and there would be a position which I'm at least open to. Call that Churchlandian dualism.
Oh, please no.
Yeah. I do want to really stress, though, that sometimes this gets, sometimes the fight gets brought up as something like neuroscience versus dualism or neuroscience versus panpsychism. You said, well, there's the neuroscientific, the brain-based program, and then there's this other program, which is something like panpsychism or dualism and so on. I think this is completely the wrong way to look at it. Neuroscience versus dualism or neuroscience versus panpsychism is not really a fair contrast. One is a philosophical thesis, and the other one is a research area. One of the interesting things that's come out in recent years is that many of the leading neuroscientists who work on consciousness and are pursuing the experimental paradigm are not particularly sympathetic to physicalism. So someone like Christoph Koch and so on has been one of the leaders in the search for neural correlates of consciousness, is out as someone who thinks that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, and what he's right now trying to figure out is those principles of correlation between physical processes and those fundamental laws connecting physical processes to consciousness. Another example is Giulio Tononi, who's put forward one of the leading theories right now in the field. And of course, it's very early days in the science of consciousness, but such as it is, I think many people see Tononi's integrated information theory as one of, if not the, leading sort of general theories in the field right now, and it's very much integrated with a lot of neuroscience and a lot of cognitive science and so on. Tononi, again, also thinks consciousness is fundamental, and he's led to endorse a certain kind of panpsychism. So let's not contrast, panpsychism and dualism with, say, neuroscience. I think these just cross-cut each other. And you find, of course, in practice, as much variation, I think, in the philosophical views of neuroscientists, or maybe not as much, but a whole lot of variation in the philosophical views of neuroscientists as we do, as one does with philosophers. So I think that, what one's getting out right now with the program of neuroscience is a project of correlates, and especially on finding neural correlates of consciousness, which is, to some extent, philosophically neutral. I mean, if you just want to say, here's where the science is taking us, and let's go no further, then at this point, most neuroscientists say, okay, well, that's why they use the term neural correlates of consciousness, because it's meant to be neutral between the more reductive claim, this is what consciousness is, and the more dualist claim, and it goes along with something else. It's just philosophically neutral. It takes further philosophical work to get a philosophical thesis out of that. Now, some of us are going to want to go on to physicalism from those results and take there to be good reasons for physicalism there. But that's going to require a whole bunch of philosophy that goes beyond the science. Likewise, some of us are going to want to go to dualism, and some might even want to go to panpsychism. I think perhaps it's early days for any of these things, but I think physicalism is a thesis that goes way beyond the neuroscience in very much the same way that dualism and panpsychism is. So I wouldn't just look to the science to settle these things. At the same time, I do appreciate what you say about the constructive research program of panpsychism, and I'm very much agnostic on whether it's going to pan out, but it is at least interesting to see people like Tononi and Koch and so on taking this very seriously from a neurobiological perspective. Okay, that's got to be more than enough.